Hello everyone, good evening. Tonight I'm pleased to introduce junior researcher Kristine Lee. Last May, Kristine Lee graduated from Harvard University with a BA in History and Literature. She wrote her senior thesis on American civil rights movement. Since beginning her Fulbright grant in late July, Kristine has worked closely with the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University and the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights. Through these affiliations, Kristine has conducted interviews with activists to better understand the values and goals of North Korean human rights activism. Tonight, Kristine will share with us a small portion of her work. She notes that NGOs have been recently begun to use unconventional means to cultivate public interest in North Korea, including radio broadcast and Choco Pie balloons. Still, she argues that these efforts struggle to compare with the news media portrayal of North Korea as a threat to global security. Kristine's research challenges us to explore the complex intersection between issues of human rights and reunification, as well as the relationship between art and politics. As well, despite the close attention at the organizational level in Seoul, Kristine's project speaks to larger regional and international concerns. Now with this, please join me in welcoming Kristine Lee.
Thank you, Mrs. Shim and Randy, for the very generous introduction. Makes my research sound very good. And thank you to everyone who made it out tonight on this really lovely spring day. I know you could all be doing something else right now, but I appreciate your coming out to this presentation. And yeah, hopefully you'll find my discussion and observations interesting. So, just to start off, I just want to talk a little bit about the trajectory that brought me to Korea today. So why am I in South Korea? When I came to Korea for my first time in the summer of 2011, I had a really interesting conversation with a research fellow who I got to know while interning at a defense analysis think tank here in Seoul. And even though he was a quantitative military analyst by trade, he talked quite extensively about an increasingly vocal group of South Korean human rights activists who were smuggling potentially destabilizing information into and out of North Korea. And they would use this using SD cards, USB drives, and CD-ROMs containing popular Korean dramas and even American movies like The Titanic, and now they've sort of upgraded to The Hunger Games, sort of adapting to modern culture. So over the course of the summer and onwards, that conversation just sort of stuck in my mind, and I began to think more broadly and more critically about how exactly political movements use art and aesthetics to compel social change. And even though I went on to study 20th century American history over the course of college, as Mrs. Shim mentioned, I ended up writing my senior thesis on the American civil rights movement. Some of the questions that were raised that summer continue to simmer at the back of my mind. And so, for instance, some of the questions that I found myself wondering were, what role do these civic groups that were engaging in these types of activities, some of them are officially designated as NGOs, what role do they play in shaping South Korean public's perception of North Korea? And have they had any success in stoking public interest, particularly amongst young South Korean people, in reconciling with the North? And are these groups actually seeking to alter the playing fields for the South's political dialogue with the North? And I think my humanities background made me more attuned to the human voices and narratives that are sort of underlying this discussion, and the voices that operate at the intersection of art and politics, as was mentioned. And so, intrigued by these questions, I wanted to pursue more extensive research on the topic of North Korean human rights, and particularly these activist organizations. And through the generosity of the Fulbright grant, I've been able to do so during my past 8 or so months here in Seoul, South Korea. So, sorry, that was a bit of a long introduction into my or why I'm here, but to actually dive into my topic, just a brief introduction to give you a bit of context about the political discussion today. So today, more than 60 years after the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, the international community's patterns of engagement with North Korea has sort of become increasingly fickle and tenuous. And so, for instance, here's a picture of President Park Geun-hye, and she sort of turned the heads of the South Korean public and also of news media around the world when she referred to the prospective Korean reunification as an economic bonanza or jackpot. And this was in a really closely followed public address that she delivered in January of 2014. And so her speech, a lot of pundits argued, and I myself believe this to be the case, was likely intended to incite excitement amongst South Korea's relatively disinterested youth, and youth for seeking an end to the division of the Korean Peninsula. And most notably, the language that she used, I put up a quick snap, what do you call that, an image of Urban Dictionary. The term that she used was the word 대박, which, out of context, it means great success or awesome. And she plucked that directly from teenage slang. And so that's sort of indicative of who her target audience was. But, even though the erratic tendencies of the North Korean regime were sort of momentarily catapulted to international headlines after, as I'm sure you all recall, this past Christmas, there was the sort of unseemly release of the interview by Sony, and it was just a huge debacle. But today, even today, just shortly after that incident, quickly seems to be losing its grip on the South Korean public's imagination. So before I dive into an actual presentation of some of my observations, I'd just like to issue a disclaimer that while my research has definitely been colored by and motivated by a desire to better understand Korean reunification prospects, the crux of my interest in inter-Korean relations has mostly shifted to the role of non-state actors in shaping the dialogue about the North Korean human rights situation. And so this is because I learned very early on during my time here in Korea that academic discussions about Korean political reunification and North Korean human rights issues are actually very distinct. And there's substantially less overlap between those two discussion threads than I had anticipated. And so that's something I sort of had to adapt my research and my approach to my research over the course of the past few months. So now it's more of like the collective human voices that gather at forums like these, and NGO headquarters, and even protests. I'll discuss this later on, but there's a pretty wide range in terms of the level of radicalism with which different groups are perceived by the public. So, there are a lot of well-established NGOs, and then there are some groups that engage in more controversial protest activities, and those groups are primarily comprised of defectors or some more radical human rights activists So these are the powerful and most vocal movers and shakers, and they're the ones that have really shaped the direction of my research. And so over the course of my presentation, I'll delve into a deeper examination of human rights activism and civic groups and how their activities are factoring into the international community's dialogue about how to engage with North Korea. So it wouldn't be right to discuss my topic without talking about the historical background that's sort of motivating the issues today. And by historical background, I'm obviously referring to the Korean War. So in the 21st century, South Korea's economic prosperity and its really vibrant and technologically avant-garde culture really masks this harrowing triple legacy of colonization, division, and civil war over the course of the early to mid-1900s. And so in the aftermath of the Korean War and the Cold War, South Korea was gripped by pretty persistent demands for change from below. And so especially throughout the 1970s, university students protested against the autocratic First Republic of Korea. And so this was under Syngman Rhee, and he was, a lot of people protested the way he ruled Korea. And so these students were protesting for the implementation of democratic elections. And at the same time, there was a nationwide labor movement that readied South Korea for political liberalization and economic globalization, or international influences through economic globalization. And so the clean and very efficiently run city that we see around us today is largely a product of South Korea's ability and willingness to change and adapt sort of in step with broader global trends. So you can sort of just take a look at this chart that I borrowed from The Economist to contrast that with North Korea. And so North Korea currently occupies a precarious position as the poorest and most isolated state in East Asia, if not the world. And in the wake of, this is largely because in the wake of the Korean War, the top political leadership in North Korea began to construct their nation's identity around a really robust and uncompromising, in contrast to South Korea's willingness to adapt, an uncompromising philosophy known as juche. And it's sort of difficult to convey the exact spirit of what juche is when translating to English, but it basically encompasses the pursuit of absolute self-reliance and political independence from other countries. So this means economic self-sufficiency and military development. And today that's most pertinent, or it manifests most clearly in the form of its nuclear ambitions. And so, even as it groans under the weight of international sanctions today, you saw Kim Jong-un, who's currently the North Korean leader in power. He revised the nation's constitution to place not only economic development, but nuclearization and to sort of reinforce those dual ambitions, and he sort of revised that constitution to further build that into the nation's ambitions. So basically, the end of the Cold War and the rise of globalization in the 21st century exacerbated the gap between North Korea and South Korea. And that really chipped away at strategic frameworks for interaction and mutual understanding between the two nations. So now, more than 60 years after its division at the end of the Korean War, in July of 1953, the relationship between North Korea and South Korea remains suspended in a really precarious state. They're not quite at war, but certainly not in a peaceful state. And this is all compounded by the emotional considerations that come with, once having been a nation and being able to call one another really blood related. So that's a brief historical background as to why studying the relationship between North Korea and South Korea matters today. So fast forwarding to modern day context, so looking at the start of the 21st century until today. As I sort of alluded to before, at the beginning of my grant period, I was primarily, and I think now somewhat naively, interested in the question of how North Korean human rights activism was shaping South Korean young people's public opinion towards reunification. And this made sense because I had been interested for quite some time in political activism on an academic level. And as mentioned before, I wrote my thesis on the civil rights movement. So prior to arriving in Korea, I had this preconception that obviously the two would be mutually reinforcing. By the two, I mean the activism and the South Korean public's receptiveness to reconciling with the North. But over the course of my time in Korea, and even though I realized this early on, it's sort of becoming clearer and clearer to me that I've discovered that amongst what you call South Korea's, what you might call South Korea's distracted youth, meaning that they're very busy, there's very little enthusiasm for seeking an end to the division of the Korean Peninsula. And why is this? Well, South Korean people simply don't see themselves as sharing the same cultural heritage with, their counterparts north of the DMZ. And so the emotional considerations and the historical obligation that you see older generations talking about, those reasons aren't really compelling to young people. And so I'll show you a series of images that compare scenes from North Korea to scenes from South Korea, and the differences between the two countries will be immediately apparent. So this is on the top, a street in Pyongyang, and on the bottom, a familiar scene, a street in Incheon. And then you'll have a metro in Pyongyang and the line 2 here in Seoul. And finally, a policewoman on a somewhat barren-looking street in North Korea, and another a busy street with a woman selling hats. So to give you some detail as to what I'm talking about, according to a survey of 1,000 people, 1,000 young Korean people specifically, conducted last September by the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, only 5.4% of people in their 20s here in Korea said that they view North Koreans as people who share the same bloodline as them. And the same poll, so this is the graph that I'll talk about next, highlighted that the same group formed primarily negative word associations when the topic of North Korea was raised to them. So, along the lines of nuclear weapons or war, poverty, famine, dictatorship, those were the words that people said came to mind when someone mentioned the word North Korea to them. And similar studies conducted by my affiliate institution at Seoul National University, the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, suggest that most South Koreans young South Koreans think of North Korea as a completely separate country. And so they expressed deeper feelings of closeness with even Chinese people or American people than with North Koreans. And so among 20-something-year-olds, that feeling of distance is most acute, with those in their 40s and 50s expressing the most affinity with people in North Korea. And given the historical context, this makes a lot of sense because people in their 20s and 30s are really generationally removed from the Korean War, and so they don't have any memories associated with once having been united with North Korea. And so as I spent an afternoon, in a crowded cafe in Shincheon preparing for this presentation, I was surrounded by university students and young professionals sort of sipping on their $4 lattes, and that's a familiar scene here in Seoul. But in that moment, I could hardly believe that, just over half a century ago, Korea was war-torn turf. And that after the war, South Korea was one of the world's poorest countries, and its economy lagged behind that of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So hopefully that provides you with a pretty broad, if not simplified, overview of where the average young South Korean person's opinion toward North Korea stands today. So to discuss the role of NGOs at the other end of the spectrum, or maybe on an entirely different spectrum, you have activists and civic groups, which are populated, some of which are populated largely by North Korean defectors and expatriate human rights activists, mostly from Western countries. And so you have these groups that have really beefed up their means of expressing their discontentment with North Korea and also trying to engage the international community. And their toolbox, it includes, some of you may have seen in my project abstract and during the session's introduction, their toolbox includes, sending shortwave radio broadcasts across the DMZ, or, in more extreme cases, sending these giant balloons, which I'll show you pictures of later, filled with political leaflets and, Choco Pies, just because they're highly valued in North Korea. So even at the time that I had first heard of these types of groups, back in the summer of 2011, this was still a relatively new phenomenon, but they occupied the periphery of South Korean public life, and they were considered to be hardly newsworthy in South Korean news media outlets. So to me, when I was reading articles on these groups, the radicalization of these groups, real or perceived, was striking because historically, under the banner of President Kim Dae-jung, and his sunshine policy, which was implemented between 1998 and 2007, civic groups largely, or broadly speaking, were considered central to promoting engagement with North Korea on a variety of fronts, whether you're talking about, social, cultural, political, or economic. And so much of the literature that I've encountered, at least, going through my university's library system or looking at articles online, much of the literature I've encountered is sort of couched in this nostalgia about this short period of détente that happened under the Kim Dae-jung administration. And so, it's because it was a time when missionary activities and sports competitions were at the forefront of how South Korea was navigating its potentially burgeoning and newfound relationship with North Korea. And so acts of civic cooperation, which were largely spearheaded by NGOs and private companies, it involved building joint industrial parks or holding sports competitions, as I mentioned before. This sort of culture change cultivated real hope in South Korea for peaceful coexistence with the North. But that quickly dissipated. And today, in marked contrast, in the wake of President Lee Myung-bak's more hardline military stance towards North Korea, you see these activists and more ideologically driven NGOs having been sort of sidelined, and now they tend to occupy the periphery of Korean public life. So to give you an actual overview of what my project has entailed, during my past few months of exploring this topic in Korea, my research has been informed structurally by interviews with researchers and program officers at human rights activist organizations and NGOs based here in Seoul. And so to prepare for field work, at the beginning of my grant period, I created a sort of informal database of sorts of activist organizations that emerged in Seoul since 2004, or a decade before I started my research, and conducted some background research on their recent activities. And I was able to conduct field research with a number of NGOs based here in Seoul that have launched campaigns both here in South Korea and abroad. And I'll talk about this later, but something I've noticed is that a lot of NGOs have began to focus more of their activities on international campaigns. And so these activities, I focused on those that have happened within the past decade to raise awareness about human rights violations perpetrated by the North Korean regime. And in particular, researchers at Liberty in North Korea, or LINK, the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, or NKHR, and the North Korea Strategy Center, NKSC, were gracious enough to allow me to interview them and learn from them. And I think the sharing of knowledge has been particularly helpful in deepening my understanding of how international civic groups are shaping the way the international community is engaging with North Korean human rights issues. So to provide you with a snippet of a case study, upon arriving in Seoul, I worked with my advisor to select one particularly well-established group, the Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, or NKHR, to shadow and understand in greater depth. And the reason why I selected this group was because they're actually the oldest NGO based here in Seoul and founded here in Seoul to be focusing on North Korean human rights. And so, I started off by analyzing in greater depth their literary output. So that involved pamphlets and photographs, campaign videos, and even newsletters as a window onto understanding their operations better, and also get a better sense of what the discussion was like amongst North Korean human rights NGOs, more broadly speaking. And so I was able to conduct or focus my field research through actually working as an intern there for the past few months. And through immersing myself in that culture and environment, I think I've been able to gain a more sophisticated understanding of the resources available to NGOs, and also their, as I mentioned, their day-to-day operations. So one of the most interesting revelations for me when I was conducting research was the extent to which NGOs, such as the Citizens Alliance or NKHR, the extent to which they deploy art, be it visual, musical, or literary, in their political activism. And this inclination for artistic engagement figured especially prominently in their appeal to expat communities based here in Seoul. So some of NKHR's more aesthetically oriented projects that I just wanted to quickly highlight here they did an art exhibition focusing on Gotjebi in North Korea, or it was a multimedia art exhibition on the human rights of North Korean children. And the exhibition focused primarily on homeless children in North Korea, and they're referred to as Gotjebi, and hence it was called the Gotjebi exhibition. And it illustrated their difficult journey to freedom from North Korea to South Korea, most often through China. And so there were audio and visual installations that shared the stories of former Gotjebi who now reside in South Korea, and many of them in Seoul. And secondly, they also had what they called a Beautiful Dream concert, and it was a benefit concert for North Korean youth who have escaped the regime and are in the process of resettling in South Korea. So, funds were used to help them apply for colleges or attain better secondary schooling, because the competition is so fierce for South Korean high school students. And so the event itself actually integrated pop performances with classical orchestral performances, as pictured here. So before I proceed, I just want to note something interesting about this increasing integration of art and politics when educating the international community. And so I think there's an interesting, if jarring parallel to be drawn here with the propagandistic devices that the North Korean regime uses to control the mindset of their public. So as some of you who follow our researchers blog may have already read, I attended a really interesting talk towards the beginning of my grant period, in which the featured speaker was he claims to have been a poet laureate of the North Korean state. And so, he was a psychological warfare officer, as they're called. And he defected to the South in 2000, and the circumstances of his escape are unclear, but he says that he left a magazine, a forbidden magazine, on a subway, and so he just had to quickly leave. But he claims during his time in North Korea to have been a favored poet of the late North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. And as I was listening to him speak, I was really fascinated by his account of having had access to a lot of Western literature, Western literature such as poems by Lord Byron, and also ancient Korean literature, and even songs that were published during the Joseon Dynasty. And so for me, that was really strange to hear, because there's no other nation that's more paranoid about how information is contained than within the borders of the country than North Korea. And so it was very strange for me to hear that people would have access to this kind of stuff. But to him, his main point was that the exposure to Western literature and this poetry and culture was extremely burdensome because of the knowledge and the emotional experiences that came with it. Because any knowledge that even vaguely resembled freedom or individuality or potential was completely useless in a system in which that controlled the way people think. And that system was so entrenched. So that's the situation in North Korea. But meanwhile, across the DMZ, you have these human rights activist groups that are trying to combat this lack of information flow into North Korea. And so, they've been really relentless in their information access campaigns as they behold this really, truly hermetic society that is North Korea. So, as I mentioned before, there are some really extreme groups that send giant balloons filled with these incendiary political leaflets and SD cards and USB drives containing information about the outside world across the border. And I just want to show you a quick clip of what this might look like. So let me exit out of this and...
A South Korean activist group flew 100,000 anti-North Korea leaflets across the inter-Korean border Monday night. The leader of the civic group, Fighters for a Free North Korea, said Tuesday that the leaflets were sent from the border city of Paju by some 20 U.S. activists from the Human Rights Foundation. However, they did not send DVDs of the interview, a comedic film about an assassination plot against North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. But the South Korean activists did threaten to launch these DVDs if Pyongyang does not accept Seoul's offer for talks.
So that last image was the picture that I sort of pasted onto my abstract, but that's just a scene of what an extreme activist group the sort of activities that they engage in. Just to quickly go back. Even though these types of activities are nothing more than a symbolic endeavor, it's often frowned upon by the South Korean government. And the North Korean regime's unease is especially apparent in the militaristic nature of how they respond to these types of protests. They shoot down these balloons, these giant balloons at the DMZ, and they, impose nuclear threats as a counter to the threat of written word, namely these pamphlets. And so, to me, that reveals the extent to which the regime is afraid of foreign narratives permeating its borders or the DMZ. So I mentioned the North Korea Strategy Center, one of the groups that I studied very briefly, but some think tanks and NGOs have adopted a much more targeted approach to getting information, specifically DVDs and films, into the hands of North Korean people through extensive networks of smugglers and middlemen in China. And so it's, they have these networks as opposed to just throwing these balloons around across the border. And so the North Korea Strategy Center, one of the groups with which I had the opportunity to study and interview, they're at the forefront of this movement. And after having spoken with the Chief of International Affairs at NKSC and learned a bit about their work with providing select groups of North Korean citizens with access to Western entertainment media, it was really remarkable to hear the stories of some of my students. So just as a quick side note, I myself and a few other people in this room teach at a school for North Korean defectors called the Heavenly Dream School. And so, I've heard stories from some of my students about having watched the Titanic or watched a movie version of Romeo and Juliet while they were in North Korea. And so they would tell me that they were captivated by these movies because they contained and conveyed emotions that were completely foreign to them. And so for me, that was a really sort of jarring and incredible moment. So, to sort of zoom out again and broaden the discussion to reconciliation with the North, in some ways, the ultimate goal of my project has been to illuminate the necessity of adopting an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach to engaging with North Korea, and more broadly speaking, conducting peace and reconciliation studies in the 21st century. And so for me in particular, this involves combining analytical methods from the social sciences with a more imaginative humanities artistic approach. So to backtrack a bit, in the 20th century, when you're talking about coming out of the Korean War and the Cold War, peace studies with regards to North Korea and international relations more broadly speaking, it focused on war prevention and conflict resolution. And that meant that a lot of the academic focus was on the nation state as the primary actor. But today, with the increasing global movement of capital, information, and people, the modern world as represented by the nation state and ethnic boundaries is no longer as relevant. And so that requires a fundamental transition in the way we approach, in the way in which we as in scholars and politicians, concerned citizens and activists approach peace studies. So as a student of history, I think that the study of political, cultural, and psychosocial aspects of reconciliation between North Korea and South Korea, I think that lends itself really well to interdisciplinary work. And that means, for me, that means that we have to undertake long-term research projects on a range of topics that involve multiculturalism and identity problems, the human rights of refugees, and human rights activism in the South, as my project has attempted to undertake, and sort of couching that in a historical perspective. So working towards sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula. As the only nation in the world divided by armistice, the relationship between North Korea and South Korea, to me, represents the often contradictory complexities of international relations in the 21st century. So notions of modernity and ethnicity and nationhood have sort of been jumbled by the increased flow of people and information. But the tension between South Korea and North Korea, that's something that's remained constant in the past few decades in the international dynamic of East Asia. And I believe that over the course of the next few decades, Northeast Asian regional security and global security more broadly will be shaped in no small part by the way in which South Korea navigates its relationship with North Korea. And so while you see this jaw-dropping speed of change in South Korea, and while that's built a culture of opportunity and progress with which I and I think a lot of Americans here in this room and based in South Korea can relate to, it's also brought a lot of changes in the patterns of civic engagement in public spheres, particularly with regards to human rights and reunification and reconciliation with the North. And so to conclude, my project has been a really exciting opportunity to capture evolving views at a really critical juncture in Korean history. And just as to leave you with the last image, this is a group of a few researchers here, I think maybe in this room, and also our students at the Heavenly Dream School. And so these are the students that we teach and get to learn from. So thank you. Oh, okay. Moving into Q&A.
Or did you want to wait?
Oh, no.
Well, I'm curious about the balloon campaign in particular, which seems to have a polarizing effect here in South Korea. It's argued by those who are in favor of keeping it up and doing it that it's an act of free speech. There's certainly symbolism involved, maybe even information gets to the North. On the other hand, there's the counter-argument is that it only escalates tension. It's actually brought military response, machine gunning of Paju, village near Paju, etc. And what I thought I heard in your talk about that part of it, these leaflets really don't do much. They don't get very far. The symbolism is wonderful, but the potential for increased discord is probably. I guess my question is it worth it?
Sure. So this is a very small section of the civic groups that we're talking about, as you may already know. And what's interesting about these groups is that this type of activity was actually started by former North Koreans or defectors. And so in many ways, it was a way for them to vent their anger against the regime. And so it's more of a visceral response that you're seeing. And the clip that I showed you from YouTube, it mentioned that it was a group of Western human rights activists. And so you sort of see these, these really gung-ho human rights activists who see something maybe even glamorous about sort of latching on to these activities that were initially started by North Korean defectors as a way of venting anger and sort of using that as an extreme form of freedom of speech. And I think, actually I'm just thinking of this now, but it's interesting to see how that derives from traditions of American protest. And, you see what were once perceived as very radical movements like the Berkeley free speech movement. You see Western people sort of latching on to these extreme forms of protest and seeing that as, as you mentioned, a form of freedom of speech, which is so central to Western countries. So short answer, it's not effective, but you got to give people their freedom of speech. So yeah. Short Sam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I was taking the train here, I was fortuitous enough to see an article that was published today in The Guardian saying that the Seoul government intends to halt the release of balloons on the 26th. This was all news to me too, but I think that was it's the anniversary of the sinking of the Chonan, which raised the question, what is the relationship between these activists and the government? Like, is it antagonistic or?
Sure. So I think I briefly touched on this, but the South Korean government really frowns upon these types of activities. They see it as being not productive to any potential for official political dialogue with the North. And so it makes sense that they would issue a statement to stop these activities on the anniversary of the sinking. And so I don't know if I would say antagonistic, but I definitely say that the South Korean government isn't a proponent of what these groups are doing. Sure.
You've seen a few of these NGOs, so I used to work at the North Korea Strategy Center.
Oh, okay.
It's nice to see it. So you've seen a few of these activists, and you've seen the different things that they do. What do you think is the best way, in your opinion, now that you've seen all these activism that they do, the most effective way of changing things within North Korea, now that you've seen a few of these organizations?
Oh, within North Korea, that's interesting. Okay. So I feel like that's sort of a leading question, given that you're coming from the...
I left for very private reasons.
Okay.
I was just curious to hear, do you see North Korean activism should go in another direction, or?
Right.
It doesn't even have to be within North Korea. What do you think?
Sure. So I think there are a number of different discussions to be had within your question. So I think to address what I think was your first question about what is the most meaningful form of activity when actually engaging with North Korean people, I actually think that, based on personal experiences teaching North Korean students and actually hearing their stories about having had access to Western entertainment media, I think because of that personal experience, I'm inclined to say that information access campaigns, not in the form of these giant balloons, but really targeted information access campaigns does have inherent merit because people are empowered when they have access to information. When people don't know about what's going on in the world around them, they don't have the means to actually compare their standard of living with, what the standard of living in a highly developed Western country might be like. So I think that might partially address your first question. With regards to engaging the South Korean public, that's a much more challenging question. I think that's something that gets at the heart of what a lot of these NGOs are grappling with. Is you sort of you're based in South Korea, but you're dealing within a different South Korean public, and so they're targeting their activities to countries abroad and also the expatriate communities. And so some of these NGOs have stated that their long-term strategy is to really galvanize the international community to influence the South Korean public, because South Korea is so closely attuned to global trends. If they hear about something happening in the United States, this new fashion trend, then they might, really grab onto that, and it'll sort of blow out of proportion here in Seoul. So I think the idea is, if they get enough pressure from the international community, South Korean people will feel the much more pressure to act and pay more attention to North Korean human rights issues. I think we had a question from Emily first.
Thank you for your really wonderful presentation. But one of the questions I had is sort of track this transition, and you just mentioned that the North Korean human rights groups were focusing on the South Korean population, this broader coalition that's an international movement. And I'm wondering, do you see a similar sort of movement away from an annual unification and more just a liberalization of North Korea having two separate Koreas and how that can be sort of model going forward?
Sure. So I think that your question also has sort of two threads to it. The first is that in my mind, when I first started my project, I had sort of lumped the two together. You know, of course, human rights activism would be related to talking about reconciliation or reunification with the North. But I think by nature of what I've been studying, and namely that's the civic groups, they're focusing on human rights issues and aren't really concerned at all with political reunification. But you have the South Korean government and President Park, whose main goal is reunification. And so I think it really depends on what group or demographic you're talking about. For civic groups, you know, they've sort of abandoned the idea that reunification, the discussion about reunification is the way to engage the public. With regards to, okay, I may be blanking on the second point I was about to address. Okay, I may have to come back to your question, but hopefully that answers at least part of your question. Yeah. It's a really good question.
I was just going to ask, quite a few years ago when the North Koreans used to send over balloons to South Korea, say the kind of standing instructions was for, say, children, if you find them in the mountains, bring them down to the police station, we'll buy you a bowl of noodles. Is there anything like that in North Korea? How are people sort of, what are people advised to do if they find a balloon?
So I think the important distinction to make between you know, what the North Koreans were doing and South Korea is that this is much more of a symbolic gesture. So there may not be as much of an intention of having people find actual, you know, physical balloons. But when you're talking about these, for example, what the North Korea Strategy Center is doing with their networks of smugglers, getting, you know, access to these USB drives through brokers in China or people in China, you know, that's really difficult information to access. And I think most of these types of groups have gathered information from what people who have defected from the North have told them. And so, you know, my experience with it is anecdotal, you know, as I told you about the students that I've worked with. And so I think, you know, the best answer I could give you is anecdotal. Sure, yeah.
Have you looked at how NGOs within Korea do domestic programs for defectors? Have you looked at how that affects the public's perception of advocacy or civic programs that happen within Korea for defectors, and how that shapes their viewing of it?
Sure. So are you talking about like resettlement programs, like education programs for defectors? Yeah, so a lot of the groups that I study, they have not only these resettlement programs, but also education programs in, you know, South Korean high schools about reunification in North Korean, the North Korean human rights situation. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that a lot of South Korean students don't, they get bored when they have to sit through these lectures about North Korea. And so that doesn't detract from the meaning of the work that these groups do, because I think resettlement programs are really important, and providing funding for additional education, academic, like have ones for North Korean defectors. I think that certainly has value, and South Korean people will acknowledge the value in that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, they'll suddenly become more sympathetic toward the North Korean human rights situation in North Korea. So sorry if that's not an optimistic view, but yeah. Right.
I was told by an education company that there's a perception among South Koreans that the North Koreans who are here receive without giving back, that they receive a lot of benefits and have sort of come to expect that without giving back. And that was the first I had heard of it, so I was like sort of taken aback by that. Is that something that like the groups that you've talked with have mentioned, and how do they combat that perception?
Sure. So I think the groups that I have worked with, they sort of have a biased perspective on the situation to begin with. But I guess just to push back a little against that myself, a lot of these groups have North Korean defectors on their staff, and the particular NGO that I've been interning at, it's like half of the staff members are defectors, and while that they may represent a very vocal portion of the population of North Korean defectors here in Seoul, they work really hard to sort of publicize, what is going on in the North Korean regime, and they even go abroad and do tours of U.S. colleges to talk about their experiences. So I think it depends on what your definition of giving back to South Korean society is, but in their minds, I think a lot of these defectors are doing what they can from their limited pool of experiences here in South Korea to give back. Yeah, really.
Yeah. I'm just curious about the role of religious organizations in relation to this activism,
Sure.
particularly the more radicalized ones.
Right.
Have you found there is any relationship to that, or is it something that's just more of a social kind of support thing? Because I've never heard, despite the fact that so many of these Christian organizations tend to support North Korean defectors, I rarely hear anything about them being like radical beyond there being, say, Korean American missionaries going to the north and being captured. So I'm interested if you could speak to that.
Sure. So admittedly, my knowledge on religious groups is a little bit more limited, but I've definitely read about religious groups and institutions that have used the similar like balloon mechanism of sending Bibles or other religious texts across the border. And so you do see some religious groups that are engaging in this more radical activity. And as you mentioned, like missionary groups who actually try to send people to the north. That would also be a very extreme way of engaging with North Korean people. Any other questions?
Oh,
Oh, sure.
You've spoken about how the balloons are more of a visceral reaction, but you've also said that your students that you teach have some exposure to movies. So how are those two related? Or how do the students get that access to those movies? Are they through the USB drives that you mentioned before? Or?
Right. So I think that the access that students have, or that more North Korean people who actually watch these movies have, is through these networks of smugglers, and that the balloon diplomacy is much more of a symbolic statement as opposed to a strategy.
So just a follow-up. So
Sure.
if it's merely symbolic, then it's not doing anything for the cause. It's actually hindering other activism.
I think it's sort of, with any form of activism for a cause, you'll have a range of activities, and the activists who are using these balloons as a means of stating what they think about the regime, for them it's just a very artistic and highly emotional way of expressing the same discontent with the North Korean regime and the same desire to change the human rights situation in North Korea. So I think from that internal perspective, it is doing something, it's contributing something to the dialogue, but it's just on a different area of the spectrum.